Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 8th edition of the Santa Clara County Office of Education's distance learning video series. This one is on computer science and computational thinking, and I welcome you to be here today. As usual, we're going to be presenting some tips and tricks, 3 of them for you to be thinking about and how to integrate computer science and computational thinking into your classroom, especially as we're now focusing on working with our kids remotely and how we can help them. You know, during this time when we may be able to step aside from some of our more content intense training and think about how we can use computer science and computational thinking to help serve in those content areas. So I'm excited about that. And as we talk about each of the tips, we'll also have an opportunity to take a moment, pause, and think about how this might actually work for us in our own learning environments. We are going to talk about both computer science and computational thinking. They both, can be loaded with information to share with you, but we'll keep it as simple as we can. We'll overlap a little bit and maybe expand it at each of them at a later point in time. So as we move on, let's think about what is computer science. And I love sharing this image from our friend Sheena in Palo Alto. Sheena helps us understand that computer science is much more than coding. And this is important for our students in our classroom to understand, because as they think about their role and what their interests are, young students may not think coding's for them, but they may be artists and they may be great writers, and they may be interested in research and learning about new things. And there might be a place for them in computer science as they continue on their educational path. So we want all of our students to understand, regardless of what their interests are, that there may be a place in computer science for them. And as you can see, computer science, coding is just one of the small parts of it. I particularly love the fact that computer science also has an interest in its impact in society. And we have a lot of very conscientious students out there that worry about, the future and what, what the environment is going to be like for them as they get older. And it's a very important part of computer science too, focusing in on, what is our role as our students grow, what is their role in providing for a clean environment, an environment that's sustainable, and how might computer science play a role in that. So that's computer science. On the other hand, we have computational thinking, which is a very important part of the problem-solving aspect of this. If you've used design thinking in your classroom, you might see the comparisons between the two. This is a practice in how to solve a problem, as is design thinking is. But in this case, the steps look a little bit different. We take data and analyze data. Well, that's what we're doing in design thinking. When we interview our users, we do empathy interviews and understand what their needs are, understand what the problems is that they're facing. We then do some decomposition, taking apart that problem and breaking it down into its smaller parts, and do some brainstorming on what those parts look like. We look at patterns. What do we see running consistently through this problem, and how can we address that? We'll pull out, make some generalizations, and then start establishing some rules or algorithms in order to try to address the problem. And then, just like design thinking, we'll prototype, we see how it works, we present it back to our user, we make adjustments, we debug, and we revise and continue to revise. So that's computational thinking and how it relates very closely to design thinking. Now, often when we're doing that in our classrooms, we may not have access to that computer side of it. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today, is how do we use that computational thinking pattern in maybe some of our other content areas to help solve problems there. And that gives you practice and gives the kids practice in understanding the vocabulary, the structure, the process as they move on through the grade levels. And hopefully, in your school that there might be an agreement that there's going to be some consistency in using that terminology. But let's move on and take a look at tip number 1. And tip number 1 is about considering what's happening at home right now. As I mentioned before, there might be an opportunity now to look at coding activities or some unplugged activities at home, where it might be really fun for the students to be working with their families, with their siblings, parents, others in their home, to do some of this activity. It's very engaging, it's fun, it inspires them to maybe do more research, to dig a little deeper, and then when they get back into school, wanting to do more and more of it at a deeper level. Very important in this all is, though, what type of access do your students have to technology, and might have to steer you in the direction of using more unplugged sources and resources, which I'll be sharing with you as we go through this. And what are your district policies about sharing different types of applications with your students? You may have that nailed already and be ready to go, but if you're not, I wanted to make sure you had access to 2 different resources. They'll give you some ammunition when you have these conversations with IT or your supervisors about using different coding and different other resources with your students, both in the classroom and outside of it. First, most teachers already are familiar with Common Sense Education as being a digital citizenship tool. It also is a great resource for technology reviews. Right now, you can go into Common Sense Media, go to their EdTech reviews, and see what they have to say about any of the tools that you might be interested in using. I'm just going to use BrainPop as a resource right now. Many of your schools may be using BrainPop already to share curriculum with your students. BrainPop is a wonderful tool for doing such a thing. They also have some very fun coding activities on there as well. Right now, we want to take a look. I'm going to take a look down here, BrainPop Junior. It seems like Common Sense Education is doing some review analysis on some of their tools. So you're going to see a little bit of this going on these next few weeks. But BrainPop Junior, as you can see, it's Common Sense Media has approved it. It's 5 stars. Teachers love it. It's grades K through 3. It is a paid app, so you get a little brief overview of what it's about here. But then if you go into it, you get much more information. And again, the overview is here. It even tells you a little bit what does it mean when it says it's paid. So you have to have that subscription for the coding piece of it. Some screenshots, pros and cons, and then into the reviews. Great resource for you to understand if this is the right, help you understand if this is the right tool for you. The other tool I want to share with you is the Student Data Privacy Consortium's resource database. The resource database provides information on how these tools handle student data privacy. Very important right now. Your district may have a protocol in place already for getting applications approved. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're not using this database. But you can go into and just see whether the tools that you want to use have already been approved. And that, again, gives you additional ammunition when you talk to your IT or your administrators to getting your hands on some of these apps. If you search the database, and I did that pretty quickly, but you just click search the database, and here you have it on this side as well. I usually go in and search by the company name. It's just a little bit easier. If I want to know whether BrainPop is approved and has good standing when it comes to student data privacy, I can come here, I can type in the name, it'll get me kind of close. Click on BrainPop, here we go. Click search. And it will tell me what kind of agreements they've had with districts across the country. And as I just look at this one, I get some immediate information. I see they all have active agreements with districts, and I see that the type of agreement they have is the Exhibit E agreement. The Exhibit E agreement is a standard agreement that the vendor has signed with the Student Data Privacy Consortium, and districts can sign on to that agreement as well. That's probably the first and foremost agreement you want to see on here. That's the vendor saying, we agree that we're protecting student data privacy, and we agree that we're abiding by COPA and SOPIPA laws in our state. If you look at some of the other tools like Khan Academy, they also have some active agreements, but they're doing them in a district by district basis. They're not signing Exhibit Es. But you might see in there some agreements that your IT department could copy or borrow from in order to get a signed agreement with them. Just because they haven't signed Exhibit E doesn't mean that they're not honoring student data privacy. They're just doing it in a different way. But this is, again, a great tool for you to use to see where they stand. This is where I learned that, back in when I was using Prezi, that Prezi was not approved for students under 13. I was using it with my kids all the time. So that was an eye-opener. So there's some good learning by getting into this. So with that, let's go to our first thought for the day, our first question for you. Who is it on your site? Who is it at your district that can help you overcome barriers in order to access tools, tech tools at your school? Do any of our guests online have, Abby or Jenna, do you have any suggestions on who your superheroes were at your sites?
I'm thinking of a district in particular, Berryessa. So Berryessa has a system in place where every school has a like a tech leader, as a teacher who also has this extra duty of supporting other teachers in using technology. So they also, all of those tech leaders meet on a semi-regular basis, not now, maybe, but they would do face-to-face meetings together. So they may be a good person to go to if you have someone on your site who has that assignment to filter those questions through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was thinking when I was at a school site, well, just about all of the TOSAs and coaches that are there in the district also. They've always been great people for me to go to ask any questions, and because they have a lot of access to working with the district leadership as well, with administrators. So they are always a really good resource. And from the perspective of being a TOSA, I always loved it when teachers would come to me and ask me those kinds of questions so that we could think through those things together.
Yeah, those are both super valuable resources. I remember when I was in the 8th grade classroom, my classroom was separated from the other grade levels, but my neighbor were the IT guys. And at lunch or recess time, I would just go through and start kicking kids out of their office because those poor guys needed to work, and the kids would just love to flock in there. And they were just too nice to boot the kids out. But just being in there and doing them that little favor, they really appreciated my help. And then they were always there to be an ear for me. And they were that sounding board that I could use to share my ideas with them. And this was back in the day as Google Apps for Education was just coming on into play, and it was being used in higher ed, but not quite getting established in elementary education. And we talked a lot about that. We tried to figure out a way, how can we get this to work in our classrooms too? And they were a great help in helping and getting that established. And now it's commonplace, but back in the day, if I didn't have their ear and their guidance, I don't know how long it would have been taken for us to get that started. So it's always great to have that person or that resource that you can go to in order to help move and make progress in the work you want to do. Let's move on to number 2. I'm going to share some very fun activities with you here. We're going to talk a little bit about integrating computational thinking into content areas. How do we do this in English language arts or math, social studies, science, so that we're starting to use a common vocabulary, we're starting to use common practices, we're starting to figure out how to, that computational thinking isn't a standalone, but can be included into the work you're already doing and not adding onto your plate as to being that one more thing that you have to do. First, let's look at the idea of using common vocabulary. 3 terms here to focus on: decomposition, patterns, and algorithms. When I first heard of the term decomposition, I immediately think of science. We talk about how things decomposite anyway. But if you think of language art and math, we're always breaking things up into smaller groups. A sentence is broken up into phrases, a paragraph is broken up into its parts, a story is broken up into its parts. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. just using the term decomposition when we're talking about looking at something's smaller parts will help build that understanding of what decomposition is when we start talking about computer science. It helps us in computer science thinking about, okay, if we address the smaller parts, the bigger problem isn't so big. Let's break it down in those little pieces. In math, when we talk about the associative properties or principles in how to solve a math problem, you do certain things, first, second, and third. But you've got to break it up into its smaller parts first. So that's one of the terms that we could use over multiple content areas. Recognizing patterns. If we use that terminology when we see in a sentence, we have a number of sentences there. Students begin to see that the subject comes first, then we have the verb, then we might have a direct object following. They start seeing these patterns. Back in the day, we used to diagram sentences so we could start seeing those patterns. We don't do that anymore, but that was one way of thinking about seeing patterns. We see that in math problems. We see it in history when we see sort of the pathways that maybe different explorers took, the routes that they took. Might see patterns in there too. Instead of using the term analyzing data, we might use the term looking for patterns. That might be another way of using it. And then following steps, that's algorithms. We used to do an activity in 5th grade, because it was part of the 5th grade language arts curriculum, to write directions that students needed to use. And one of the options for the kids was write directions to get a student from our classroom to the office. And most students did the direct route. There was always the creative thinker who decided to use the most indirect route to get a person to the office. That included maybe wandering in and out of the 4th grade classroom, zigzagging through the lunch benches, through the hall, and then to the office. But that person had to make sure, if he was writing that algorithm, that he did it absolutely correctly, because he didn't want to be made look silly. He wanted the person running the pattern to look silly, but he had to make sure that thing worked very accurately. And those really creative thinkers love this type of activity because it gave them that opportunity to really express themselves in one of the most simplest sort of activities. But we didn't use the term algorithm. We used the term, step by step. We now would replace it with the term algorithm. Any other thoughts that my guests could think of that would be a type of activity where we could use decomposition patterns or algorithms?
Well, I'm thinking about all these things that I'm doing now that I'm stuck at home, and how I'm using computational thinking when I'm doing things like baking.
Yeah.
So I feel like the more I bake, the more efficient I'm becoming, and in the kitchen and at following recipes. Like, I know the things that I need to have out and need to have ready, and I'm starting to figure out the order of the wet ingredients and the dry ingredients.
Right.
And so I feel like I'm using it in the kitchen. And then also I've been doing a lot of making, because Abby and I are taking a makerspace class. And so I just bought a Cricut. So
right.
It's been amazing, but I decided to design my own finger puppets. And just in using Adobe Illustrator, I'm finding that there's a more efficient way for me to go about making the different pieces and putting them on different layers. So the more I get used to practicing with it, I can see how that really relates to the steps in computer science and computational thinking, in making that workflow really efficient, so that it doesn't take as long for me to get to the actual printing and cutting out of the fabric, so that I can actually put my finger puppets together.
And sometimes you don't recognize this until you've done it a few times, and then you start recognizing the patterns that are working for you. You start seeing the steps, the algorithms that work for you, and it's a big aha moment, right?
I love your examples, Jenna. I don't
Yeah.
have any smart examples like that.
But the cooking one is just, I think, another example of all three. You know, you have a recipe that has dry ingredients and wet ingredients. You have to, that's a great example of decomposition. You have to deal with one first, and you have to deal with one separately. And sometimes, when it doesn't come out right, you can say, okay, did I mess up with the wet ingredients or did I mess up with the dry ingredients? And that's exactly what computational thinking does for you. Great, thanks. Awesome. So I want to go back and look at a couple more things. We didn't even look at these two. I'm going to share with you some resources from San Francisco Unified School District. They have put together a phenomenal website here that has all sorts of curriculum and ideas on computational thinking and computer science for all grade levels. As I scroll down their homepage, there we go. I think it's going to get a little slowly today. We have the grade levels here. They're noted on the left. I'm going to go, and it goes all the way down to 8th grade. I'm going to go into K2. I love starting with the littles because that's also a great fuel for thought for older grades. Get them thinking about how they can alter these activities a little bit. They've divided also their K2 curriculum into, newbies and all the way up to, yeah, we got things going in here. And even when you go into these, they break them down even further as to whether you have devices or not. If you have BBOTs, we'll put you in Unit 2. If your kids are using Scratch Junior and doing some coding, we'll put you into Unit 3. But let's take a look at the unplugged activities. There's two really fun ones here that I think would be pretty adaptable for distance learning. The first one is the secret handshake. This teaches sequencing and setting up those patterns. The secret handshake would have to be something that a student could do with a parent or a sibling, somebody at home. But what a fun way to get some family interaction. And I could even see this if a student, your young student is working with their parent, that some of the older students and older siblings might want to get engaged in this one too, just because they want to be part of the fun. This asks your students to make up their own secret handshake. And it starts by showing a video, and all the materials and the videos are attached here by Cuckoo Kangaroo and on their secret handshake. And after you watch the video, the kids would create their own and attach symbols to each of the aspects of their handshake. So I'm trying to decipher what this handshake might be. This looks like this might be a rainbow, and then we have happy hands. And then we have something, I'm not quite, maybe a camera, I'm not quite sure what that is, but that could be part of their handshake. The lesson plan gives you some options to give kids just 3 options, and then practice making their own. But all the information you need is here, including any of the videos and the instructions in moving into this. We'll just take a quick look at the lesson plan. You see how it's completely drawn out. It has the video attached. It has 3 different types of icons for 3 different handshakes: the wave, the ice cream cone, and the, they don't call that an octopus, they call it a squid, I think. And then the options for the kids to make their own. If this was done in the classroom, the fun part about this is that they would be able to teach others how to do it and have that social aspect. But they can do that in the house as well. The other activity I wanted to share with you out of this one is it really closely ties to reading, and that's called Nevertheless They Persevered. And this one has the students either reading or listening to a story called Morigami, and then making their own origami patterns or algorithms. I'm sorry, their own origami algorithms. Say that fast 3 times. So the lesson plan actually includes a video of the teacher reading the book Morigami. But if your students have access to books or have other origami related books, they could be reading along with you as well. And then this includes the algorithms too. And they're not, they don't have text attached, they're all visual. So the students can just follow the steps in making their own origami at home. Really fun. I have, when I was thinking about this, I have 2 pieces of origami that my nephew, who's in 4th grade, has made. He gave these to me earlier in the spring. This one's a canoe, which I could totally see relating to 5th grade social studies, having kids build canoes if they're talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition, possibly. This one's a frog, and this could relate closely to some of your animal sciences. And actually with this frog guy, if you push down on his butt, he'll pop and fly, and he'll actually hop. So, there's other ways of tying origami into some of the other content areas. So these are some special ones for my little fourth grader. So let's keep moving along here. So thanks to San Francisco for sharing those wonderful ideas and curriculum with us. There's some other resources here on how to integrate computer thinking into or computational thinking into your curriculum from Edutopia and from Digital Promise. And I invite you to take a look at those too, and they're all in the notes. So my question to you, how might you integrate computer science and computational thinking into your distance learning?
Just thinking about how in December is Hour of Code, right? And now we have this like really extended period of time where students might have the opportunity to do 15 minutes a day of code through Hour of Code. And there are choice boards out there that teachers have made for their classes for that period of time that could be easily shared by any teacher, no matter their comfort level in computer science. The second resource that just came out, I think, out of CS First, they just sent out a bunch of resources on how to do it at home with your children as well. So I'm trying to think of some like just plug and play things that students can, just watch the video and do some learning on their own time.
And you have totally led us into the third tip, which is let's get some of those resources out there for students to do at home. And what are those things that are very easy for teachers to use and access? And those applications that you were just mentioning, I have them listed here in this spreadsheet. This is just a collection of, it's actually two different sheets. One is those ones that you've mentioned, Abby, that teachers can access and then push out to their families, whether it's via Google Classroom, an email, Seesaw, what have you. And it's not moving now, but they're all listed here with grade level equivalencies to them. So there's CS First is in there, code.org, a lot of different ones. And as you get into your older grade levels, some of the things that might include app development as well. Many of these are free and or at very low cost. The other page on here is just some of those, oops, that was unfortunate, just some of those applications where families could just look at some apps and just do these with their own students. This page is divided up by grade level, by age. So depending on what the parents might find is age appropriate, they can dive in here and do their own, I want them to make sure that they're searching out and making sure these are safe. But on both of these pages, both of the apps are both 4 or 5 star recommendations from Common Sense Education. So these are all quality apps. But we want to make sure that teachers and parents are making those decisions for themselves and for what's best for their students. There's also code.org unplugged activities and CS unplugged activities. Again, a lot of this depends on what type of accessibility your parents have, your families have at home. But there's a lot of options out there. And I totally agree with Abby. So I think this is just one of the best times now for teachers to consider some of these alternative activities that's for fun, that's engaging, that families can do together so that they can continue the learning, but in a really fun, engaging way. How might you share coding opportunities with your families? I think, Abby, you touched on it in the last one, just by pushing some of these fun things out there. Jenna, anything that you might have in mind?
I think Abby made us a great suggestion about using those things that are already there, those playlists, those choice boards, sharing them with families. And I really love that spreadsheet that you shared. That's a great resource.
Great, I hope that becomes a useful tool for our teachers. Well, thank you. All these resources and more are included on the notes for this vlog, and there is the resource for you there, bit.ly/SCCOE vlog 8 notes. And we hope that you can use this and dive in and access some interesting tools in relationship to computer science and computational thinking. There's, like I said, there's just so much out there, and we're just giving you a small bite for now of what you might be able to do with your students as you engage them in distance learning. It is, for us, Friday. It's been quite a week, and Abby and Jenna, thank you for all the work you've done in helping getting our other webinars, our previous webinars, and our ones to come moving forward. Monday, we're switching to math, and we're going to be working with our math coordinators. They're going to be on at 3:30. They're going to be working a little bit later in the day, and hopefully they'll have an opportunity to really engage our math teachers in some great conversation about how to get math out to our students in this digital space. So thank you again for joining us. Please contact me if you have any other questions or have some ideas to share in how to use computer science and computational thinking out there with your students as they're learning from home. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.